Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 207, and I am the show's host, Kyle. Joining me on today's show is author Brian Saady, who you could find at his website, briansaady.com, BrianSaady. He has a new podcast that you all should check out called Rackets, and you can find that at his website as well. He's been published on antiwar.com, the American Conservative. He's posted on the Mises Institute website, and the author, I guess the book we'll reference probably most today that he's author of is The Drug War, a $1 trillion con game. Brian, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
No problem. And you were actually a guest way back on episode 133 of the podcast. So, it's great that I'm, finally in the episode 200s, I'm having return guests that are other than Will Porter. So,
yeah.
Yeah, and why I have you on the show today to get into is really the situation in Colombia. One of the things that prevents me from talking about Colombia more on the show is just I don't even know where to start. I know there's this long civil war thing with the FARC, and I'm pretty sure they're communists, but I'm not positive about that. There's a government there. Pablo Escobar was there once, and that's where cocaine comes from. So, hopefully we'll kind of set this up so myself and my listeners going forward, when they read stories about Colombia, they'll kind of know what the truth is, and that way we could even start to understand what the media skew is, because knowing nothing, you don't even know what they're lying about when you read their stories.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to start off with kind of just, I guess, who are the FARC?
Okay. Basically, and you opened it up mentioning the communist part. Back in the 1960s, there were some members of the Colombian Communist Party who basically branched off and formed their own guerrilla group. And they've been at war with the government for over 50 years. Eventually, these paramilitary groups jumped into the war, fighting against them as well. And back in 97, the United States actually designated them as a terrorist group, and it is deserving. Some of the left will sort of poo-poo the war crimes committed by their group, but they are legitimately a terrorist group. A lot of the ways that they financed their movement, in the beginning, it started out mainly just kidnapping people. It was usually people from like the business or political elite, hold them for ransom and take that money. Eventually they started to move into the drug game. And as they sort of captured territory, they weren't actually doing the trafficking or growing the coke. What they do is essentially, quote unquote, tax the trade. So kind of like the way the mafia makes you pay protection money. That's what they would do. And eventually they became full-on drug traffickers, as well. But they've been through this process before, but in 2016, they actually were able to come to an agreement, to end this civil war. And it was again, for over, I think it was 52 years, if I'm remembering right. But over 200,000 people were killed. The vast majority of those people, were quote unquote civilians. So in other words, they weren't actually people involved in the fights. They were just victims caught in the middle of it. And really the biggest statistic, that really, can tell you a lot about this conflict is there were roughly 7 million domestic refugees, from this fight. So in other words, you've got government forces, paramilitary forces, and these communist guerrillas. They're fighting for territory. And again, people basically, they had to leave their homes, abandon their homes, those homes were taken by force. And again, they're refugees within their own country. But again, and that did end, in 2016. And for the most part, this group really has made a fairly good faith effort to actually withhold their end of the bargain. For the most part, I would say, as far as the peace deal is concerned.
Now, I guess the FARC movement, our group itself, was it like an ethnic thing? Was it an ideological thing?
Very much an ideological thing. That is a Marxist group. It, again, was just really, again, anti-government that really essentially wanted to start their own state and their own ideals. But yes, very much a communist movement. As I kind of mentioned, the drug part, a lot of the members, they sort of kind of lost a lot of that ideology. And there's a term in academia you'll hear a lot of times where they talk about the crime terrorism nexus, because a lot of these terrorist groups, they have to pay for their movement in a way, and it's usually through crime. And then a lot of times those lines are blurred. Are you an organized crime outfit or are you a terrorist group? And what I'm meaning is that a lot of the members kind of shifted away from revolutionary type ideals and then just basically converted into full-fledged criminals. So when that agreement was signed, again, a couple years ago, not every member of the FARC actually turned in their weapons and decided to demobilize. Roughly about 7,000 members actually did go forward and demobilized, but there's over 1,000 of them who are what most people label as dissidents. So they're basically they're criminals, they're cartel members, they're terrorists. And in my opinion, sort of got hooked on the dirty money. They make millions and in fact even billions of dollars. And a lot of those guys didn't want to go back, to go back to a sort of a peaceful lifestyle. They got hooked on the drug money, and it's not just drugs, but they make their money from a lot of different illegal rackets, but drugs are the main one.
And I guess that shouldn't come as a surprise to my audience because it sounds like with the Taliban where, it's really driven them more and more into the heroin market when at first, they were kind of just collecting tax money. At this point, they're actually operating the refining facilities. And at the same time, you have now people who are, members of the Taliban, but are really just, the local opium warlord who, controls the opium fields and, sends some money off to the Taliban, some kids off to fight for him. But that's, kind of the situation there. I was just wondering, I know this is like a 50-year-long civil war, so this is obviously impossible to just summarize, but, did the FARC, they seem to have been like a major problem for the government. Did they hold a large amount of territory or, do you have like an estimate on like their strength as far as number of fighters at any given point to just give a context?
You're right. Towards the end of the struggle they were probably, like I say, around 8,000 or so members. Roughly 10 to 15 years ago was probably their peak. Some estimates that they had up to say like 20,000 members. And again, it's kind of tough to put exact numbers on that, but in the 20,000 member range. One thing, and I would like to point out is they're not the only communist Marxist terrorist group within their country. Now they're by far the most powerful. There's another group called the ELN. And that's what sort of makes, how this peace agreement goes forward. It puts so much importance on it, because both sides are sort of saying that they're not holding up their end of the bargain. Well, meanwhile, you've got the ELN lurking in the background. They're roughly about 2,000 members. They commit all kinds of terrorist activities as well. They're also involved in drug trafficking and all types of violent crime. But they're watching and seeing how this unfolds. So if the Colombian government doesn't hold up their end of the bargain that was negotiated, it doesn't really give them, the ELN and these other communist groups much incentive to go forward and put down their arms as well.
So I want to get to the peace process, but really quick before we do, just during this civil war, did the U.S. pick a side? I know you mentioned that at one point they labeled the FARC as a terrorist organization. Did the U.S. ever support the FARC or provide arms to the Colombian government to fight FARC?
Oh, yeah. Most definitely. Unofficially, yes. But absolutely. The U.S. definitely picked a side. So I mentioned that the FARC was labeled as a terrorist organization back in 97. The paramilitary group that was their main nemesis, the biggest group within those paramilitaries was a group called the AUC. And that group was actually designated as a terrorist group in 2001. And in my opinion, there's a lot of politics behind that because the U.S. government was fully aware of all of their activities. And in fact, the paramilitary groups were actually responsible for much more violence than the FARC. Roughly twice as much violence is actually traced to the paramilitary groups. And in my opinion, the reason for that designation, why it took so much longer, was because Congress wanted to pass what's called Plan Colombia. And that's basically where we've been giving billions of dollars in military aid to the Colombian government. And one of the real roadblocks for passing that bill was the atrocious human rights record of the Colombian government. And the thing is, the paramilitaries are deeply connected with the Colombian government. They're no longer officially paramilitaries with the government. They label them. There's an acronym called BACRMs or BACRMs. So they're more or less considered organized crime. But at their height, these paramilitary groups were deeply ingrained within the culture, within the Colombian government. There's an unofficial term called the parapolitics scandal. And basically, over 10,000 government officials, politicians, high-level business people had deep ties to these paramilitary groups that were, again, killing FARC, and they were also killing a ton of just innocent people who were caught in the middle of that warfare. So again, the U.S. government, to get to what I'm trying to get across, is the U.S. government has been fully aware of all of these atrocities, yet the money just keeps piling in and piling in. Since 2000, when that plan started, we've given them over $10 billion worth of military aid. And again, we've known the U.S. government has been fully aware of just horrible atrocities that have been committed by the Colombian government or their proxies. One of the most notable scandals is a scandal called the false positive scandal. And what that was roughly at least a few thousand innocent civilians were murdered by government military forces, the Colombian government military forces. And what this was is they would kill innocent civilians, put put clothing on the dead body to make it look like this person was a member of the FARC. And that way they could boost their stats. And if they were boosting high enough kill counts, they would keep getting more and more money from the U.S. government. But yeah, to say the least, absolutely, the U.S. government has 100% been on the side of the Colombian government and essentially turning a blind eye to the war crimes that have been committed by that government. So yeah, it's pretty. And the thing is, it's kind of obvious, our policy. We've essentially had a Cold War. Even though the Cold War ended, the U.S. government is always trying to root out that left-wing communist movement throughout the world. And it doesn't matter, the war crimes that are committed by the forces that are trying to stamp that out. We'll keep giving them money and keep arming them, basically.
This goes a little bit outside what I plan to talk to you about on today's show, but are you aware of, has the policy changed at all under Trump, or if the U.S. is currently still giving that military aid?
The thing is, Trump has threatened to, quote unquote, decertify. A lot of people aren't really familiar with that term. And it has nothing to do with the human rights abuses. It has to do with their counter-narcotics effort. And I probably should back that up. Plan Colombia was always been rooted as a counter-narcotics effort. It's always been the name of the drug war. But what it really, the unofficial action is, it's really been a counterinsurgency effort. But Trump, he's partially right, because if you look at Colombia's record as far as interdiction and cocaine production, it's never been at a higher level. But we've never stopped this money coming in. The money just keeps going out there. So basically, his point is that if they're going to if they're not going to make real progress as far as interdiction and cut down on the production of cocaine, then he wants to decertify their government, essentially saying that they're not making an honest effort as far as drug interdiction. It's really kind of disingenuous. One of the things I have a lot of problems with that. First of all, it's an indirect criticism. But there's been a lot of investigative reports about the Trump Ocean Club in Panama. And to be really concise, it essentially was a hub for money laundering for a number of different organized crime groups. And that included Colombian cartels. So, you know, the other factor is you want to go and put all of this pressure on Colombia to knock out the supply, but what about knocking out the demand here in the U.S., where, you know, we're the number one consumer of cocaine. So again, I consider that, you know, a really disingenuous, notion by Trump, but he is actually in one aspect, bringing some level of honesty as far as Plan Colombia by pointing out that the program hasn't been effective as far as its counter narcotics goals. But the real truth of the matter is that's not really what we've been giving that money for in the first place. It's really been a counterinsurgency effort, on that end.
Well, you mentioned the cartels there. Is there a connection between FARC and the cartels? You mentioned they were involved in drug trafficking, but I guess I don't know. Or if there's a specific cartel that FARC was more aligned with, or I have no idea.
Really, where the biggest alignment is not necessarily with the cartel. Well, some people call them the Cartel of the Suns. And that's an unofficial name for actually the Venezuelan military. Their best ally has actually been many government officials in the Venezuelan government. It's for numerous reasons, mainly in ideological reasons. Obviously, when Hugo Chavez was in power, he openly was very friendly with the FARC, and he had some backdoor relationships with them. Obviously, Maduro's been friendly to their group as well. A lot of the drug deals, and this has been, there's been certain documents that have come out, and what it is a lot of the Venezuelan generals have basically traded guns for coke. But yeah, there's a deep connection between them and the Venezuelan government, as far as trafficking. Yeah.
All right. So moving on to kind of now back to the peace process. My knowledge of the peace process is kind of that the FARC is transitioning from a militant insurgency to a political group that will kind of exist within Colombia, but in their own communes. So I guess can you explain at least what the peace process and what the ultimate goal of the peace process is supposed to be?
Okay. Again, yeah, exactly. You pointed out that they want to become a political party. And part of that peace agreement was that they were guaranteed 10 seats in the legislature. They have several candidates. They just had they had the presidential election, which is going on now, and the second round of that will be actually this Sunday. But as far as the legislature, that was a couple months ago. And they had several candidates they put up there. They got less than 1% of the vote. But that was one of their main points as far as the negotiation, is they did want to have members who represented them in the legislature. So they are guaranteed 10 seats in the legislature. They're supposed to get a stipend for money, for food. They're supposed to get these communes that will be protected by government forces. On the other end, they're supposed to turn over all of their weapons. And they've given over a ton of weapons. The question is that truly all of their weapons? I mean, nobody really knows. They're also supposed to hand over their assets. And just to give you a good idea of how much, crime pays, they've showed that they say that their full assets are it's like over $300 million, in assets. And the thing is most scholars believe that they're holding back. A lot of studies suggest that they've got literally about $3 billion in assets. And again, with money laundering, it's pretty easy to hide all this kind of stuff. The financial markets, there's millions of ways to launder money. Most people believe that they're not showing a good faith, part as far as that with the peace agreement.
So I guess other than the FARC not showing good faith on giving up all their guns possibly and giving up all their financial assets, how is the peace process going? I think I had read that, that some of these international agencies that were tasked with monitoring it were saying that the disarmament process was going well and that thousands of these people had been disarmed.
Oh, absolutely. And again, what I'm doing there is speculating. But there is some educated, guessing behind that speculation. As far as, violence and actual peace process, there seems to be no actual violence, from anyone who is still an actual member of the FARC. Again, thousands of their members really have demobilized. The ones who are being violent are the ones who have openly said that they're no longer connected with the FARC. They're truly dissidents. So as far as the violence end, that is the one thing that is truly, that they have absolutely shown good faith. And now on the reverse side is the Colombian government is supposed to, provide protection for them. And there have been several of their members who have been murdered, roughly like 50 or so. And there's also been, and they're not exactly members of the FARC per se, but they're also just we're talking about left-wing social leaders in Colombia, and several of them have been killed. Since the peace agreement, literally over 200 different social activists have been murdered. Almost every one of these cases goes unsolved. And it's, you can read between the lines of whether the government really wants to protect these people. Just to kind of explain for the listeners, as I was kind of pointing out before, the Colombian government has sort of been in bed with the right-wing paramilitary death squads. And there's a long history of that. And most of those murders have been committed by, again, they're not really paramilitary groups anymore. They're now what they call bakrams, but those are the successor groups of those paramilitaries. And the reason why, there are many reasons for those murders. For one, anybody who's, say, a labor leader, they're considered, these crime groups consider those people a threat. A lot of those, social activists, they're also land rights activists. And it's a particularly important issue in Colombia, because during that civil war, roughly 15% of the actual land in the country, was taken away from the homeowners during that war. Again, it goes back to those 7 million refugees. So now that the war is over, there are a lot of these land rights activists who want to get their homes back. And the problem is they're getting murdered left and right by these organized crime groups. So again, and the FARC are pointing to this, because even though those social activists are not members of their group per se, but there is an ideological alignment with those people. And basically the organized crime groups have been allowed to operate with impunity. So yeah, there's positives. The peace process overall does seem to be heading in the right direction. The scary thing is they've got a presidential election that is going on. They had the first round. The second round again will happen this Sunday, the 17th. And the presumed winner is a very right-wing, candidate, Ivan Duque, who is pretty open that he doesn't want to keep up this peace process. He thinks it was too soft for them. And if he starts to really buck and try to change that up, there's a good chance that the FARC could scrap this whole peace deal and go right back to war.
So, just to rewind a second, just to understand and clarify, the 15% of land that was taken by the Colombian government from.
No, that's actually I'm glad you asked that. That's primarily from the paramilitary groups, but also by the FARC. So, and it's not really, and this is really an urban versus rural kind of issue. This war really, it wasn't fought in the big cities. It was fought off in the jungles and these extremely rural areas, which is essentially ungoverned land, where whoever's the most powerful warlord rules the area. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about with Afghanistan. It's pretty similar. But yeah, that land was taken away by these different terrorist groups, more so on the right-wing paramilitaries. But yeah, literally, like I said, 15% of the land in Colombia. And Colombia is a large country. But yeah, literally, that is the government's estimate for how much was taken away from people, or they were again, forced to be a domestic refugee within their own country.
And I imagine this has to be extremely complex. I mean, I've talked about, like the situation with Israel, that even if you do grant the, Palestinians the right of return, there's several complicating factors, as to, who now owns the land, what's now built there, how many times has it even traded hands since the last, Palestinian had owned it, and stuff like that, is really going to make these situations more complicated. Not to mention if like, one person's land was turned into like 3 different houses, or, there was 2 plots of land. Now there's 3 houses there. What do you even do with that? And so I'm sure if this conflict goes back 50 years, there's some people who, everybody involved is dead, or, now the grandchildren have competing rights for it. And it has to be just a mess to try to figure that out.
Unbelievably. So you absolutely hit it on the head. But here's another complicating factor. Colombia is an incredibly rich country as far as resources. There's oil, there's gold, there's silver, there's coltan. Like most people haven't heard of that mineral, but that's a necessary part that goes into cell phones. Again, an incredibly resource-rich country, and in some cases, private companies have come into that land and started extracting resources. It is a very complicated issue. A ton of different special interests involved there. Yeah.
Right. And so you already started talking about the recent presidential elections, and this show will air on Friday, and then the final election will be Sunday. But we had the first round of presidential elections, and I guess I'm guessing in Colombia you need like a majority of votes to win. So you have a first round of voting, there's like 8 candidates, and this gets whittled down to 2. So how did that round of voting go? What did we learn from it?
The first place, Ivan Duque, the right-wing candidate, he came out with roughly 39% of the vote. And just to kind of give you a little bit of his background, he's pretty much the protege of a former president there, Alvaro Uribe, who, when you want to talk right-wing paramilitary, that's the guy. There's been some declassified U.S. documents that sort of point to the evidence with his connections with the paramilitaries. And in fact, the Colombian Supreme Court actually has an investigation going on right now, to point to those links, and witnesses they just keep getting murdered left and right. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is, again, these aren't really good faith actors as far as preserving a peace deal. And again, the guy who will most likely is going to win this is going to be Ivan Duque, who has that prejudice, going into this. The second place candidate is a guy named Gustavo Petro. He got roughly 25% of the vote. He was the mayor of Bogota, but there's a lot of extremes in the politics of Colombia. And when I say he's left wing, he's extremely left wing. This guy was actually a communist guerrilla with a different group, a group called M19. Some of the listeners may be familiar with that name. That group was primarily, at a point, was actually funded by Pablo Escobar. There was a really big event back in the 80s where they actually stormed the Supreme Court, held people hostage. And again, this guy was part of that group. And again, that was decades ago. He sort of distanced himself from that, but he's kept the very left-wing politics. And he's also, in fairness, been a real critic of the corruption that does take place in Colombia, and sort of pointing out much of that sort of right-wing bias and the connections with the paramilitaries. You got a third place candidate, a guy named Sergio Fajardo. He's more of a centrist, but even the centrist is pretty right-wing there. The guy's a former math professor. He was the governor of Antioquia. That is the state where Medellin is the capital. And again, you say the word Medellin, and most people kind of have a certain image that immediately comes to mind. It is no longer basically the murder capital. It's actually a very low crime area now. A ton of money has been put into the infrastructure there. Now, a lot of that is from drug money. When I'm saying low crime, I'm saying low, less violent crime. It's still a major drug trafficking hub. It's just that the organized crime outfits have sort of come to this agreement, understood it's best for business to keep the violence down. But what I kind of want to point out again is he's the centrist in this election here. But he's coming from Antioquia, that is a region which is thoroughly dominated by the successor groups of the paramilitaries. So the guy who's in the center still has these, loose connections with paramilitaries, at least a sort of, ideological, I don't know. I can't think of the term I'm looking for, but again, that's the centrist, within the debate. Now he himself, if he were elected, Fajardo has said that he wants to maintain the peace deal. The lefty, Petro obviously wants to, but then the leading candidate and who presumably will be elected, Duque, he wants to make major changes to the peace deal. And that could easily, have some really dire circumstances if he does.
So are we talking about possibly the FARC picking back up arms or something of that nature?
I hate to say it, but it has happened in the past. Back in the early 80s, they had a temporary ceasefire, and there were similar circumstances. They formed a political party. It was called the Patriotic Union. They had several candidates, and back then in the 80s, some of those candidates actually won office. They even had some presidential candidates, but those guys were assassinated, and literally thousands of their members were murdered by, either government forces or their proxies or the paramilitaries. And eventually they just, they dropped the whole peace process and went right back to war. So, I mean, there is some precedent here as far as the political assassinations. It's not as high as the last time in the 80s. But there are elements, there are circumstances that are, that could make that happen, that could reverse that peace deal. There's one contentious matter right now. When I mentioned earlier that, the FARC, they're supposed to get 10 seats in the legislature. Well, one of their leaders is actually under arrest right now. Guy's name, goes by the nickname of Jesus Santrich. And the reason is that the US DEA has accused him of arranging a deal for something like 10,000 kilos of cocaine. We don't know what the actual evidence is so far, but it looks like he will probably be extradited to the US to face those charges. And then it becomes this question, do the FARC get to replace him or do they have to give up that seat? We don't know how all this is going to unfold. And that could be, one more thing that just adds to the peace deal falling apart. I really hope that this does stay in place, but there are a lot of factors where you could see how it all falls apart. And one of the things, that it should point out is this peace deal, that was a matter, that was through legislation through the Congress. Originally, this was supposed to be a referendum for the people, and it came down to this razor thin margin. Something like 50.2% of Colombians voted against the peace deal. But then the Congress went in there and they eventually did solidify a deal. So if you have a new president and who says he's, looking to change this up, that could be very likely.
All right. Well, I guess to take us back where we start before we, get out of here is that, like I said, I really don't know, where to go for news on Colombia or stuff like that. I read about, North Korea, Afghanistan, Yemen all the time. And I know, what journalists are good on that issue or, where's a general good place to go for news, but I really don't see news on Latin or South America hardly anywhere. So do you have just maybe either an author or two that you like or a place or two that, I could send my listeners if they want to try to keep up with this evolving situation in Colombia?
Obviously, there's the Spanish language news, but as far as English language, I think it's called ColombiaReports.com, does a really good job. There doesn't really seem to be any sort of political bias as far as their work. There's another group that's a think tank. It's called Insight Crime that does absolutely fantastic work. Again, apolitical. And I hate to connect crime with Colombia, but the crime has such an impact on the politics. So that would be a tremendous resource that I would point on. It's not just for, as far as Inside Crime, it's not just for Colombia. They focus on all of Latin America and the Caribbean. There's America's Quarterly. That has a little bit more of I would say at times a little bit more of a right of center, twist to it. But again, the information in there is excellent. Now one thing I'll throw out there, I might get some tomatoes thrown back at me. I would point out Telesur. And that is it's basically government propaganda from the Venezuelan government and some of the like-minded governments as well. But the reason why I point them out, and again, you have to completely look at it with a grain of salt, but a lot of these stories about, say, left-wing social leaders who get, executed, that stuff doesn't really get picked up by most mainstream press. So again, you can look at that with a grain of salt. But, they do cover at least one side. And again, it is obviously a very biased perspective, but it's important to understand all of the different sides in this struggle. I do put some news up on my website, but, those would be as far as the primary, sources I would give you. I would point to those in particular.
Yeah, and I'm sure my audience won't be too turned off to go back to the usual place we're talking about, the Middle East. Al Jazeera is the Qatari, state media,
exactly.
But at the same time, I talk about Al Jazeera all the time because a lot of times they're the only ones covering the issues, especially if you're looking at Palestine or Yemen. So. Right.
And you leave it up to that reader to use their own brain, understand that that's the filter. It's coming, from it. But I think, Al Jazeera does some fantastic work, but again, you just have to know the money behind the source. But, and again, take all the different information, look at the other side, and then sort of form your own opinions.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really got a lot out of this, and I think it's really going to help me to understand this situation going forward. And now I got some awesome, new places to go check out to get news from there. Brian, is there anywhere you would like to send people? Give all the plugs you want to give.
Oh, sure. If you'd like to check out some of my work, you can go to my website. Again, that's briansaady.com, BRIANSAADY.com. I mentioned that before. I update it with different news columns, Colombia is some of the focus as well, but just all types of different news issues. That's on my website there. If you want to check out my podcast, it's called Rackets Podcast. That's on, I believe, pretty much every, podcast provider there, particularly iTunes. And like I say, I am an author. If you are interested in the subject matter, I covered it quite a bit, in my first book, The Drug War, $1 Trillion Con Game. And like I said, I got a lot of other work. You can always keep up to date with it, as far as social media, primarily Twitter and Facebook. And my, handle is my name, Brian Saady. So, I really appreciate you having me on here, Carl.
Yeah, thank you so much. For those of you who want to check out the actual page for the show, I'll have show notes for this episode. Brian has sent me some links before the show, and I'll link to those. I'll link to the sources that I recommended, and of course, his website and all of his work. I'll make it real easy for y'all to find at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. And then my Twitter handle is at KYAAALE. And Facebook, check out Libertarian Union, and my news website is immersionnews.com. So check all that out for like the daily updates and news stories. All right. Thanks again for coming on.
Oh, thanks so much. Have a great one.